الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على النبي الأمي العربي القرشي المكي المدني الهاشمي صاحب قاب قوسين محبوب رب المشرقين والمغربين جد الحسن والحسين النبي الحرمين والإمام القبلتين والرسول الثقلين الذين سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتخبين المنتجبين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين روحي وأرواح العالمين لتراب مقدمه الفداء واللعنة الدائمة الباقية على أعدائهم ومنكر فضائلهم وغاصب حقوقهم أجمعين من يوم عداوتهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه تبارك وتعالى في كتابه الكريم وهو أصدق القائلين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله الذين مع التقوا وهم محسنون صلوات على محمد وعلى محمد. For the honor of Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam, can we have a second salawat? And to hasten the reappearance of our awaited Saviour, can we have a third one in your loudest voices? Whenever I invited to do a series of lectures, I always choose to have one of those lectures about a sermon from the masterpiece of Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam that we call Nahjul Balaghah. The reason why I do this is because, a little bit like the Holy Quran, it is a book that adorns all of our shelves, but many of us are unaware of the contents in the book. So before I talk about the sermon that I've selected for our discussion this evening, I'd like to briefly talk about the book itself. What's the background to the book, who wrote the book, who compiled it, and what is the rank of the person who did so. So the book, of course, is called Nahjul Balaghah. It's a compilation of the sermons, letters and sayings of Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam. It is compiled by a scholar from the 4th century after Hijrah known as Sayyid al-Sharif al-Radi. Sayyid al-Radi is a student of Shaykh al-Mufid alayhi rahmah, who is also one of our greatest scholars from the 4th century after Hijrah, and his time coincides with the minor ghaibah of our 12th holy Imam. Sufficient to mention the rank and greatness of Sayyid al-Radi is a story that Ibn Abil Hadid al-Mu'tazili mentions in Sharh Nahjul Balaghah. He has a commentary on Nahjul Balaghah. In that commentary he mentions a story with regards to Sayyid al-Radi, that Shaykh al-Mufid alayhi rahmah was very famous in the city of Baghdad, which is where he's from, and he's also buried there, that he used to give lectures and lessons in many fields in the religion of Islam, many Islamic sciences. Amongst them, of course, the science of jurisprudence, which we call fiqh in Islam. And also usul al-fiqh, the principles behind the jurisprudence. So one day, after having given his lectures, he goes to sleep and he sees that he is in the masjid giving the lecture. And while he's in the masjid giving the lecture, he notices that a woman who's dressed all in black walks into his lecture, and she's holding the hand of two young children. And she says to Sayyid al-Radhi, she says, "These are my sons Hassan and Hussein. Oh Shaykh, I want you," she says to Shaykh Mufid rather, she says, "Oh Shaykh, I want you to teach them usul al-fiqh." And he wakes up with a cold sweat. He's thinking that, how can I teach people who are infallible, who are imams? He doesn't understand the meaning of this dream. He's very worried. He thinks maybe he's done something wrong. The next day he goes to his lecture as normal, and as soon as he starts his lecture, he notices that a woman dressed in black, just as he had saw in the dream, walks into his lecture. And she introduces herself and she says, again, as he had saw in the dream with two young children, she says, "This is my son Murtada and this is my son Radhi. I want you to teach them usul al-fiqh." So now the Shaykh understands his dream. He starts to cry. The people ask him, "What is the reason for you crying? The woman has only asked you to teach her sons." So he says, "These aren't any ordinary people. Hazrat Zahra Salamullah alayha came in my dream to instruct me, and this is the meaning of what I saw last night." Can we have salawat ala Muhammad wa alayhi? Now I think it's sufficient to mention the rank and greatness of Sayyid al-Radhi, who is the one who compiles Nahjul Balaghah. If any other proof is needed, then it is sufficient to state that he is one of the greatest scholars of the Shia madhab, and Nahjul Balaghah is one of many of his works. And he dies at the age of 41, having compiled all these books and all this work. What does Nahjul Balaghah mean? There's various interpretations of what Nahjul Balaghah might mean, because both the word Nahj and Balagha in Arabic have different meanings. One meaning of the word Nahj is peak, is the top of something. And Balagha means eloquence, means rhetoric, means the excellence in language. So it is the peak of eloquence out of the sermons of Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam. Another interpretation is that Nahj means way, path, and Balagha means vast. So this is a path which is very vast. There's something in it for everyone. Either way, either it is the eloquence that is being talked about, or it's the path that is great and there is something in it for everyone. The selection, of course, not all the sermons of Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salam are in Nahjul Balaghah. The selection is on the basis of the eloquence of the sermon. What kind of language has been used in the sermon, that is the basis of selecting this sermon for inclusion in the book. To the extent that all the way up to the 20th century, the book Nahjul Balaghah used to be taught in many Arab countries, in the universities, as Arabic literature because it was the finest example of Arabic prose from any era and any time. Even by those who profess enmity towards Amirul Mu'mineen used to teach it because there was no better example of Arabic prose than Nahjul Balaghah. Amongst these masterpieces of Arabic prose is a sermon that we're going to talk about today, which is in various different copies of Nahjul Balaghah, either Sermon 192 or Sermon 193. It's called, or it's referred to as the Sermon of the Muttaqeen. It's also referred to as the Sermon of Hamam, because the person who asks the Imam to deliver the sermon, or the companion, is called Hamam. What's the background to the sermon? The background to the sermon is that Amirul Mu'mineen is in the masjid, and this man called Hamam, who is mentioned to be a very pious individual, he comes to the Imam and he says, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, I want you to tell me about the Muttaqeen in such a way that I am able to see it in front of me. I'm able to imagine, I'm able to visualize what a person who's a muttaqi looks like. The Imam alayhi salam hesitates in his reply. Instead, he recites this verse of the Quran which I've just recited. He says, Hamam, ittaqullah wa ahsin. Observe the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do good deeds. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna Allaha ma'al ladhina taqaw wa hum muhsinun. It's the final verse of Surah An-Nahl, 16th Surah of the Holy Quran, verse number 128. Surely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with those who observe taqwa, and He is with those who do good deeds to other people, who do favors to other people. So the Imam says to him, this is the summary. Observe the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and do good deeds. But it goes on. He says that Hamam was not satisfied, he was not fulfilled by this response. And he pressed the Imam to the extent that he gives an oath to the Imam to speak. So when he gives the oath, then the Imam alayhi salam speaks, but even before he speaks or he talks about the Muttaqeen, he mentions a muqaddama, a preface to the sermon. Now, as far as speaking is concerned, as far as mentioning a sermon or delivering a sermon is concerned, most of us who come up here and speak do so after meticulous preparation. We spend many hours reading and making notes and preparing, and then deliver whatever we have to deliver. And then even then, despite the fact that we spend this time preparing and making notes and then delivering, we still sometimes say things that we don't want to say. Sometimes we leave out the things that we need to say, such as the nature of the human being when he speaks. This sermon of Amir al-Mu'mineen has been delivered with no preparation. There's no preparation in this sermon. Hammam has just come to Amir al-Mu'mineen and he said, I want you to tell me what the Muttaqeen are like in such a way that I'm able to see them in front of me. So before the Imam talks about this, he gives a preface, a prelude to the sermon. And he says that praise be to Allah who has created things as they're supposed to be created. What does this mean? Whoever creates, whoever innovates, whoever makes something, whoever invents something, does so on the basis of some kind of model being in front of them. They use something as a model in order to to improvise, in order to innovate, in order to create. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created when there was nothing to improvise from. There was nothing. There was no matter that was in existence. In another sermon, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Amir al-Mu'minin talks about the creation, where he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created His power, and through the power He created everything else. So as far as matter is concerned, even before the matter there's the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which has been used to create everything. So He's created everything as it's supposed to be created. And everything that's being created has a purpose in its creation, and everything that it needs has been provided for it beforehand. Then he says something very interesting before he's going on to talk about the Muttaqeen. Before he's going to go on and tell what are the characteristics of those for whom the Quran is guidance, as you just heard. This is a book which there is no doubt in it. Hudan lil Muttaqeen. It's a guidance for everyone? No. It's a guidance for those who are Muttaqeen. So now he's going to tell us who are these Muttaqeen in so much detail. But before he does that, he tells us something that is enough for us to appreciate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the fact that He has, of how merciful He is. He says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created things. He created things. He created human beings. While He was free from the fact that He was not going to benefit from their obedience to Him, nor was their disobedience going to harm Him. He created them. He ordered them to be obedient and ordered them not to be disobedient, but in such a way that their obedience, their ita'at, was not going to affect Him. It was not going to benefit Him in any way. If everybody in the world stopped believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He would still be Allah. And if everybody started believing in Him, He would not increase in being Allah. He would still be the same. So people believing in Him or not believing in Him do not affect the fact that He's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says that the obedience of people did not benefit Him, nor did their disobedience, nor did the fact that they sinned harm Him in any way. And then He distributed the sustenance amongst them without regard for who obeyed Him and who disobeyed Him. The fact that somebody who obeys Him receives sustenance the same as the person who disobeys Him. There are so many people in the world who refuse to acknowledge the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet He doesn't stop their sustenance. They still receive the sustenance just as those who believe in Him receive. So He has separated the fact that there is sustenance from His obedience and disobedience. People will obey and disobey, but they will still receive the same sustenance. He doesn't kill the people who don't believe in Him. But then He goes on. Now He comes to the issue of Muttaqeen, which is what Hamam has asked him about. He says, and now out of all of these people, the ones who obey, the ones who disobey, the ones who receive sustenance despite the fact they obey and disobey, وَالْمُتَّقُونَ هُمْ أَهْلُ الْفَضَائِلِ. And out of all of these human beings, the best of them, the people of distinction, the people of merit are whom? Are the Muttaqeen, are the ones who realize their duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the Imam starts the sermon. After this introduction, telling us that he's free of their obedience, he's free from their disobedience. The obedience doesn't benefit him, the disobedience doesn't harm him. The sustenance is being received either way. whether you believe or you don't believe. I.e., there's no obligation for a person to believe in order for him to receive sustenance. No, he's going to receive sustenance anyway. Now the merit is going to, the meritorious out of those, the ones of distinction out of those are the ones who obey him, because they don't have to worry about the fact of whether they're going to receive sustenance or not. That is guaranteed regardless of what a person does. But if someone wants distinction out of everyone, then he has to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the way that he wants to be obeyed, the way that he desires people to obey him. Now the Imam in this sermon mentions 110 characteristics. Now of course, if I was to even mention 100, each one of those 110 would need 110 minutes, even if I was going to spend 1 minute talking about them. So no fear, I will not mention every single one of them, because I've already taken enough time and there's only a little bit of time remaining. Well, what I'll do is I'll give a summary of what the Amir tells us in this sermon of the 110 characteristics. But there's one thing to bear in mind, and that is something I previously mentioned as well, which is that when the Imam speaks, whatever deserves to be given more importance is given more importance. Whichever is given less importance means it is supposed to be given less importance. Now if he's mentioned something in a particular order, it means that this is the importance that he's giving those things. If he's talked about something first, this means that in the eyes of Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam, in the eyes of the one who is the Imam of Muttaqeen, this is the most important characteristic of a person who is a Muttaqeen, is the one who is God conscious in the eyes of Amirul Mu'mineen. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi. What is the first thing that he talks about? The first characteristic that he talks about? Does he talk about prayer? Does he talk about fasting? Does he talk about Hajj? Does he talk about any of these actions which are amongst the wajibat? Don't get me wrong, this is not an invitation for me to say that prayer is not important. Prayer is important. But the Imam is telling us that the Muttaqeen, those people of distinction, what is the most important thing that distinguishes them out of everyone else? The Imam says their speech, when they speak, it is to the point. He doesn't say that they don't speak. He says they speak, but they only speak what is necessary to be spoken. I.e., when it is necessary to speak, they will speak. When it's necessary to remain silent, then they will remain silent. They won't speak unnecessarily, but at the same time, when it's necessary to speak, they won't remain silent. There is a narration that's attributed to the Holy Prophet of Islam, where he says that every single morning when a person wakes up, the tongue asks all the other body parts of a person how they are. The tongue addresses the body parts. It says to the arm, to the leg, to the various body parts, how are you this morning? All of the body parts reply with one thing. They reply the same reply. What do they say? They say that if you, this tongue, remains in control, we'll be okay. Every single body part says, if you remain in control, we'll be okay. This tiny bit of muscle that we have, every one of us has it. Yet it's capable of causing so much havoc. It's a tiny muscle, it doesn't even have a bone in it. Yet it's capable of causing so much havoc. Amirul Mu'mineen says that's why it's the first characteristic I'm telling you. That a person who is a muttaqeen is one who has control over this very powerful and potentially destructive muscle of his. That he knows when to speak and he knows when to remain silent. In this regard, very briefly, there is a social issue that exists in our societies. That issue is the issue of ghibah, of backbiting. And it's related to the tongue. Because we speak about other people behind their back. Now when somebody is called up on this, or somebody says to another, you shouldn't speak about this person, this is wrong, it's haram. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala compares speaking about another person behind their back, the act of ghibah, as the same as eating the flesh of your dead brother. When somebody calls someone up on this and they say, you shouldn't do this, why are you talking about another person? The person defends themselves and they say, what I'm saying is true. Brother, what you're saying is true, that's why it's ghibah. That's why it's backbiting. That's the definition of backbiting. That what you're saying to another person is true, but if this person hears of it, they will not like it. People don't know about it. You happen to know about it. It's true. But if this person learns that you've told somebody else, they will not be happy with you. They will not be happy for this piece of information to be spread. That's the definition of ghibah in Islam. If it's not true, if it's a lie, if you accuse someone of doing something that they haven't done, then that's slander, that's tuhma, that's two sins. One is of lying and the other of backbiting, of speaking behind someone's back. The fact that something is true is not a defense against backbiting. The fact that it's true is why it's backbiting, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is like eating the flesh of your dead brother. Why? For what reason? What's the reasoning behind it? The reasoning behind it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considers the believer so worthy of respect, has so much concern for the feeling of the believer, that even if something's true, but it's not a desirable characteristic and nobody knows about it, if something is public, if for example a person publicly does a sin, al-iyadhu billah, a person publicly drinks, or a person publicly does some other kind of sin, in that case it's not ghibah, this person is publicly doing it. The point is, if there is something that a person is not publicly doing and people are not generally aware of it, if a person comes to know about it, his obligation is to not tell anyone. If he tells anyone, then that's ghibah. Imam alayhi salam says, the person who is a muttaqi, the one who are the people of distinction, their first characteristic is that their tongue is under their control. The tongue doesn't control them. The tongue is under their control. There's numerous ahadith about this. Amirul Mu'mineen himself says that the wise man thinks before he speaks, and the fool speaks and then he thinks. Otherwise the tongue was not under his control. That's why he spoke, then he realized, maybe I shouldn't have said this. The wise man thinks, then he speaks. Another narration tells us that the vast majority of the sins are associated with the tongue. Keep this under control and you will be saved from numerous sins, not just this one. What else does it tell us? It tells us that a person might pray, he might fast, he might go for Hajj every year, but if his tongue isn't under control, according to Amirul Mu'mineen, he's not a muttaqi. He might be able to deceive other people. Say, I'm a big worshipper, I pray a lot, I fast every other month, I go to Hajj every year. Amirul Mu'mineen says, no, a muttaqi is a person, a believer is a person who is safe from the tongue of another believer. Why? The fact that these are acts and obligations that a person has to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Allah chooses, He can forgive them. But as far as acts against other believers are concerned, Allah will not forgive anyone unless that person forgives me. If I backbited against somebody, al-a'adhu billah, and I pray to Allah, forgive me, Allah will not forgive me until that person forgives me. And if that person doesn't forgive me, I'm in trouble. Because on the Day of Judgment, then he claim, I haven't forgiven this person. Allah, you might have forgiven him, but I don't forgive him. Then what am I going to do? The Imam tells me, look, when it comes to sins against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a possibility you might be forgiven. When it comes to sins against other people, you have to make sure that you go and ask the other person. And what happens when it comes to the other person? The ego gets in the way. Why should I go and ask forgiveness from him? Why should I go and ask forgiveness from him? Imam is telling us this is what the Muttaqeen is about. These are the people of distinction who their tongue is under their control. Then he says what? He says their dress is moderate. Their dress, the way that they dress is moderate. It's not extravagant. They don't go excessive. We mentioned yesterday that the Holy Prophet of Islam refused to speak to people who were dressed extravagantly, who were dressed in a way that was not befitting of their status. A person has to dress moderately. There isn't a particular dress in the religion of Islam. There's no particular dress prescribed that a person has to dress in a particular way. No, but whatever dress he wears has to be moderate. It has to cover all those areas that Sharia has asked him to cover. The dress has to be moderate. It has to be appropriate. This is the Imam is saying, first characteristic is that his tongue is under control. Second characteristic, the dress is moderate. Third characteristic, the way that he walks is humble. Doesn't walk on the earth as if he is God's gift on earth. Doesn't walk on the earth with pride. The first person and the first individual to be thrown out of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was Iblis. For what reason? For what reason? Aba wastakbara wa kana min al-kafirin. He disobeyed. Then what did he do? He was arrogant. He was proud. For this reason he was out after 6,000 years of worship thrown out of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You and I were not even going to live for 6,000 years. We won't even have 6,000 years of worship. His 6,000 years of worship was all wasted on a moment of pride. He said, I'm better than Adam. I won't bow down to him. On the regular, what do I say? I'm better than that person. I won't ask forgiveness from him. He should come to me. I'm better than that person. I won't go and say salam to him. He should say salam to me. Who said so? Who decided? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the servants of Allah are the ones who are humble, not the ones who are proud. Why? Because what do you have that is worthy of taking pride over? If anybody deserves to be proud, if anybody deserves pride, that's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is the one who's worthy of pride. He's the one who deserves to take pride over everything. Nobody else. What do I have to be proud of? Amir al-Mu'mineen says. He says, I am surprised at the human being. أَوَّلُهُ نُطْفَةٌ وَآخِرُهُ جِيفَةٌ. His beginning is a sperm drop, which is najis. And his end is a dead body, which is also najis. And in between it, this blood that's flowing through his body is also najis. What is there to take pride over? The beginning to the end, and everything that's in between. This is the reality of the human being. Muhammad is saying, he says, over what part of this do you take pride over? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you. Whatever He gave you is out of His grace. If He was to take it away from you, you wouldn't even be able to lift up your head with pride. A very famous story that when Ibrahim alayhi salam and Sarah alayhi salam were passing through a particular area, the king of that area happened to lay his sight over Hazrat Sarah, wife of Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam. And he was dazzled by her beauty, and so he reached out his arm to do something wrong. Ibrahim alayhi salam prayed to Allah. His hand became of stone. He realized that this is an ordinary person. He says to Ibrahim alayhi salam, he says, pray to your Allah to make my hand go back to normal. Ibrahim alayhi salam prays. His hand goes back to normal. Some people, they don't learn the first time. He does it again. Again his hand turns into stone. Again he asked Ibrahim alayhi salam to pray. Again his hand returns to normal. Then he does it again. This time when he does it, now he's convinced that this isn't a fluke. This isn't some kind of magic trick. This person has power. So out of his embarrassment, out of the fact that he tried to do this, he attempted to do this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blocked him, he gifts one of his maid servants to Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam. She is Hazrat Hajra, who is later the mother of Hazrat Ismail alayhi salam. What this story tells us is that over one particular act that this person was about to do, Allah made his hand turn into stone. Every time I do something wrong, Allah can do the same thing to me. That He doesn't is His benevolence, is His mercy, is His grace that He doesn't do that. But He can. He has the capability to do that. If there's anything that I take pride over, use me as an example. If I take pride over the fact that I'm a very good speaker, that I get invited all around the world to give lectures, so I'm a very good speaker, I take pride in that. On what basis are people listening to me? The fact that I can speak, the fact that I have the ability to speak. Who gave me this ability to speak? Who gave me this ability to speak? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me the ability. And at any moment in my life, He can take the ability away from me. And if He does, then there will be no pride left. Because nobody will listen to me, because they can't hear me anymore. There's no ability to speak. Imam is telling us, there's nothing to take pride over. Every moment of your life, you'll be thankful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Stop, realize, and say, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me. This is a sign of those who are God conscious. This is a sign of those who realize their duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam wants his followers to be like. When the Imam mentions 110 of the characteristics, he goes into detail. He tells us about what they do. They stand up in night in prayer. They spend their days in fasting. They are thin like arrows because of the fact that they spend so much of their time in worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are so thin that people think they are sick. People think they're unwell. Yet, in reality, everybody else is unwell. They are healthy, but people think they're sick because of the state that they see them in. And when they read the Quran, Fortunately, you and I, we have it adorned on the shelf. In the holy month of Ramadan, it comes down, if we're lucky. And then it goes back on the shelf again for the rest of the year. And then it comes down if somebody dies. And if someone's reading Quran, we say to them, who died? Our teachers used to say, the Holy Quran is a book for the living. We made it into a book for the dead. The Quran is a book for the living to open up and act upon, to guide their lives. We've made it into a book for when somebody dies, we open the Quran and we read some Quran for this person who's died. Let's send some thawab because we read some Quran. The Imam says the Muttaqeen are those who, when they read the Quran and they come to a verse which talks about paradise, it is as if they are in it. When they read that verse about paradise, it's as if they're in it. And when they read a verse about the hellfire, then their whole body starts to shake. And they pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, may we not be in it. The Imam goes on, he tells us the characteristics. He says, what is seen in them is that when they have knowledge, they have the forbearance of how to use the knowledge. And whatever they say, their action matches their words. The Imam summarizes everything. 110 characteristics. When Hamam hears this whole sermon, he falls into a deep swoon and he dies. Having heard this definition and this characteristic of the Muttaqeen, Hamam dies. He can't bear this. Allow me to say that these 110 characteristics, if truly, genuinely we go and look for them, we won't find them anywhere other than in Amirul Mu'mineen. This is the graciousness of Amirul Mu'mineen, the humility of Amirul Mu'mineen, that he doesn't say, these are my characteristics. He says these are the characteristics of the Muttaqeen. Even though, if genuinely you want to look for every single one of these characteristics, the only person you'll find them in are in the infallibles. The Imam is saying the one who has a couple of these characteristics, he can be considered a Muttaqeen. The one who has all 110 of them is Imam al-Muttaqeen. The one who has all of them, he's Imam al-Muttaqeen. Hamam dies. The Imam says, I had this fear about him. Because receptive minds, when they hear such things, they are affected by them. A man stands up from the Khawarij and he says, Ya Ali, then why didn't you die? The man says, why didn't you die? The Imam ﷺ replies with something which, the conclusion of the sermon, gives us another important lesson. The beginning of the sermon told us about the creation and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made distinct the obedience and the disobedience from sustenance. At the end, he tells us something that is committed to our beliefs. The Imam says, the time of death is fixed, it's preordained. This was only a cause for him to die. His time of death was preordained, and everybody's time of death is preordained. There are just causes of how the person dies. The time is preordained. Then the Imam says, don't repeat this statement again. What he had asked, why did you die? The Imam says, don't repeat this statement again. That shaitan had put onto your tongue. That shaitan had put onto your tongue. We found out that there's certain people, their tongue is speaking, but shaitan has spoken using their tongue. Imam alayhi salam is telling us that there's certain people, they speak. It appears that the human being is speaking, but in reality it's shaitan speaking using their tongue. The time of death is preordained, it's fixed. But the way that you go to your death, there's different causes of how the person dies. This, the Imam gives us the summary of what a person is supposed to be like. What characteristics a person, in a person whom Amirul Mu'mineen considers a Muttaqeen is supposed to look like. And the summary is this, that a person not only in his duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in his responsibilities to other people. Why? Because when we talk about speech, and we talk about dress, and we talk about the way a person walks, he's affecting other people. Imam is telling us, it's not sufficient for a person to go into the jungle, open the musalla and start praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, you've got to live in the society. And you've got to deal with people, and you've got to deal with the difficult people and the easy people. But the test is, how do you deal with people? Test is, how do you deal with people? How do you react to people? When you and I, we become angry, what happens? Everybody becomes angry at something or another. The test is not becoming angry. The test is, how do I react when I've been put in that situation? The Imam says anger is a form of madness. Anger is a form of madness. He gives a proof for this. He says, because when a person subsides from his anger, he's regretful for what he said or what he did while he was angry. And if he's not regretful, then the madness is confirmed. If he's not regretful over the fact that when he was angry, he said something or did something that he wasn't supposed to do, then the madness is confirmed. Imam alayhi salam, not only through his words, through his actions tells us. Through his actions tells us what? How you deal with people. This is what makes you great. This is what makes you worthy that 1400 years later, people are still sitting in every corner of the globe talking about Amirul Mu'mineen. Why? Because even to his enemies he was gracious. To his friends he was gracious. To his enemies he was gracious. To be gracious to your friends is no big deal. We all are. It's how you treat your enemies is what will be remembered later on. That this person, even to his enemies, was gracious. They came and they swore at him. He turned round and he said, do you need something? Can I help you with something? If you need food, I can give you food. If you need somewhere to stay, I can give you somewhere to stay. Can you imagine if someone comes and swears at me, I'll swear back at them? How dare you speak to me like that? Amirul Mu'mineen is the Imam. He's saying, look, this is how I treated people. I didn't just say it, I didn't just tell you. I showed you how it's done. I showed you how it's done. And every single Imam does exactly the same thing. He shows us how it's done. Shows us that this is how you treat the enemies. Even after everything. After everything. Can you imagine? I usually say that whenever the religion of Islam was in need, was in difficulty, needed someone to support, then the one who came to that support was always Ali. Whether that was Ali ibn Abi Talib, whether it was Sajjad, whether it was Ali al-Akbar, whether it was 6-month Ali al-Asghar. It was always an Ali which came to the aid of the religion of Islam whenever the Islam needed it. It's mentioned that when everybody had been killed, those of you who've been for ziyarat, picture in your mind that the Imam alayhi salam comes to Tille Zainabiyya and he stands on Tille Zainabiyya and he says, Hal min nasirin yansurna. Is there anyone to help us? هَلْ مِن مُغِيثٍ يُغِيثُنَا? Is there any supporter to come and support us? Did the Imam need help? Did he need support? Everybody had been killed. No, it was a cry. It was a final chance. Does anybody want to help themselves? There's still a time. There's still some chance for a person to save themselves. If somebody wants to help themselves, come, the door is still open. Somebody wants to save themselves from hellfire, there's still a chance for them to be saved. Nobody responds. There's a sound of crying from the tents. Imam Hussain ﷺ comes back into the tents. He asks Zainab, I'm still alive. I'm still alive. Why are the women crying? Zainab Salamullah alayha says, oh my brother Hussain, when you cried out, Hal min nasirin yansuruna, Ali Asghar dropped himself from the cradle. He can't speak, right? 6 months old. He's telling his father, he's saying, oh my father, if the religion of Islam needs one more sacrifice, I'm here willing to give that sacrifice. Can you imagine? The men went into the battlefield, they fought, and they were killed. In which culture, in which society is a 6-month-old baby killed? The 6-month-old baby, Hussain alayhi salam takes Ali Asghar. He says, I will ask them for some water. Every single person had gone into battlefield to fight. They knew he was going to fight. Imam says, well, I'll go and get some water. He goes towards the enemy. He's using his abad to cover Ali Asghar to keep him away from the sun. The enemy calls out, Hussain is bringing the Quran. When he gets closer, he removes the cloak. They see it's a 6-month-old baby. Hussain alayhi salam says, he says, maybe you think I've done something wrong. Maybe in your eyes I'm a sinner, I've done something wrong. The baby hasn't done anything. The baby hasn't done anything. The mother's milk has dried up. Give the baby a drop of water. Nobody moves. Hussain alayhi salam places Ali Asghar on the burning sand of Karbala. And he says, if you think I will drink the water when you bring it for the baby, I put the baby on the ground. Give the water yourself. People in the forces of Yazid had children as well. Some of them began to cry. Some of them began to cry. Umar ibn Sa'd sensed that there's a problem. He calls upon Hurmala ibn Kahil al-Asadi. And he says, what does he say? He says, Iqta kalam al-Husayn. Sever the words of Hussain. Hurmala ibn Kahil al-Asadi, famous archer of Kufa, picks out the biggest arrow he has, a 3-pronged arrow. 3-pronged arrow. An arrow which is used to hunt elephants. 3-pronged arrow. He puts it in the bow. He releases it, he misses the target. Puts the arrow, another arrow in. He misses the target again. Umar ibn Sa'd comes next to him. He says, Hurmala, what has happened to you? If somebody had asked me, who is the best archer in Kufa, I would have mentioned your name. How have you missed the target twice? He says, Umar ibn Sa'd, what should I do? Every time I target the arrow, the curtain of the tent moves up. I'm fearful that the mother of the baby is watching from the tent. The third time he puts the arrow in the bow. He releases the arrow. Now remember, Hurmalayat said, وَإِقْتَى كَلَامَ الْحُسَيْنِ. Cut off the words of Hussein. The arrow is targeted at the neck of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Rabab might have called out from the tents, Ali Asghar, if something happens to Hussein, remember I will never forgive you. Ali Asghar, as if he hears this from the tents, he positions himself in the way of the arrow and the neck of the Imam. The arrow is targeting the neck of Hussein. Ali Asghar gets in the way. They say the 6-month-old neck was severed. How big is a 6-month-old neck? How big is a 6-month-old neck? It's a 3-pronged arrow. The blood starts to flow out. Hussein alayhi salam wants to throw it to the sky. The sky calls out, Hussein! Not a drop of blood should come to the sky, otherwise rain will never drop from the sky. Hussein alayhi salam wants to throw it on the ground. The ground calls out, Hussein! Not a drop of this innocent blood should drop on the ground, otherwise no crop will ever grow. What does the Imam do? He takes the blood of Ali Asghar, he rubs it on his face. He looks up to the heavens, he says, Allah, I will come to you on the day of judgment with this blood on my face and ask you for justice. What did the baby do? May Allah bless your tears. May Allah give you no grief other than grief of Ahlulbayt alayhi salam. Now what does the Imam do? Every single shaheed that gone into the battlefield, they knew who was going to fight. They knew who was going to die. The 6-month-old baby had gone to get water. Now what does he say? What does he do? With which face does he go into the tent? Hussein alayhi salam, Imam of the universe. He says, how will I face the mother? He goes forward, he says, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Surely from Allah we come, to Him we return. He steps back, he says, Ridam biqadaihi wa tasliman li amrih. Oh Allah, I'm happy with what you have decreed for me, but how do I go into the tents? He goes forward, he goes back. It's the sunnah that we do in the Amal of Ashura. He does it 7 times. Somehow he walks into the tents. Can you imagine? How does he walk into the tents? He walks into the tents and he says, Rabab, who am I? She says, you're the Imam of the time. He says, if I order you to be patient, will you be patient? She just looks at the baby. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't say how. She doesn't say why. She just says one thing. She says, Amithluka yunhar. Do they sacrifice someone as young as you as well? There's only one person on the day of Ashura who gets a burial. Imam Hussein alayhi salam goes behind the tents. He digs a small grave and he puts Ali Asghar in the ground. It's customary, you know, that once the grave is filled, then water is put on the grave. Where should Hussein bring water from? He sits on the grave and he starts to cry. He says, Ali Asghar, these tears are the water for your grave. On the morning of the 11th of Muharram, when all the heads are placed on spears, one of the army of Yazid comes forward and he says, a head is missing. They say, which head? They say, the head of the 6-month-old baby. He said, where is the head? They remember that Hussein alayhi salam had buried the baby. Now what do? They take the spear and they bang it into the ground looking for the body of the baby. Eventually they find the baby. The baby is also placed on the spear. No mercy even after the baby is killed. Ala wa la'natullahi ala al-qawm al-zalimin wa sayalamu alladhina zalamu ayyamun qalami yanqalibun. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Mata bi Hussein. Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein.